Hey everybody, thanks for coming out. I am Dave Goldenberg. I'm the chair of the Ridgefield Affordable Housing Committee. Before we get started, I had a couple of things I wanted to address. First, there have been some questions posted online about the quote legality of this session. It's legal. It was noticed. There was not an agenda presented because it was my understanding that an information session doesn't require a full agenda, especially if it's called information and community input on affordable housing. It's pretty clear what the agenda is. But I checked, and however, out of an abundance of caution, this is not a meeting. There is not a quorum of Affordable Housing Committee members here tonight. So it is simply a public information question and answer session. It's being recorded. Those members who are not here tonight will watch the videotape, so all of your comments and questions will be preserved and passed through. So I'm the chair. The other members are Ken Rohrer, vice chair, who is here. Sharon Lamb, who is secretary, not here. Kevin Brown, not here. Whit Campbell, not here. Sharon Coleman, not here. Deborah Francischini-Gaccia is here. Lauren Mazzola is here. And Krista Willett is not here. Second thing I wanted to address was Prospect Ridge, because I saw that there was some confusion, and that's probably from an article in the press that was not entirely clear. This is not about that. We can certainly talk about that. I'll bring you up to date on where we are. Tomorrow night is the Affordable Housing Committee meeting. It will be webcast. You can watch it. You can ask questions if there's sufficient time at the end. At that time, we will be looking at a preliminary map that tells us what is the buildable area on the property in question. So I think a lot of your questions, or at least some of them, will be answered tomorrow night, so I urge you to attend. Can we go to the next slide? Thanks. I just wanted to talk a little bit about process. So we're talking tonight about the Affordable Housing Plan. Now, under a state law, and then we'll talk about this in a while, we are required to create a plan by mid-2022 and update it every 5 years. We're starting now. There's been some preliminary work, some data analysis, but we're starting today with a public meeting. There will be a community survey. There will be committee planning sessions. They will probably be virtual, but they'll certainly be public. There'll be a draft report in January. Public information about what's in the draft report through February and March. There'll be plan revisions in April. In May, there'll be a public hearing, a vote to adopt the plan, and then it will be submitted to the state. Are there any questions about that process specifically? Great. It is my pleasure to introduce Glenn Scholder from Planometrics. Glenn is a planner and has worked extensively with Ridgefield for what, 20 years or more? Yes, you were a kid when you started. And he will be guiding us through the process, and I'm happy to say we were awarded a grant, a planning grant by the Department of Housing, which enabled us to bring in Glenn so that we can make sure to provide the best solution possible for Ridgefield. So with that, I'm going to introduce Glenn. He will take you through a presentation, and then we will have questions and comments.
Thank you, Dave. As Dave indicated, my name is Glenn Scholder. I'm with a professional planner with a firm called Planometrics. As Dave indicated, I have had a chance to work with the town on a number of projects. I think most significantly, I worked with them in around 2005 in terms of comprehensive rewrite of the zoning regulations, and then 3 town plans, 1999, 2010, and the most recent 2020. So through that process, I gained some familiarity with Ridgefield. So I'm hopeful that that will allow us to have a great conversation tonight in terms of affordable housing and the affordable housing plan. So We have put together a PowerPoint here tonight, and the main purpose is to try to provide some basic information about this process and work that's going on, but then quickly get to question and answer so that we can have a discussion, because our purpose here tonight is to hear from you. So just some background. In 2017, the state legislature passed a public act that said all 169 municipalities in the state have to prepare an affordable housing plan, and it can't be older than 5 years. And so here we are, magically, 5 years later, and 169 towns around the state are all working on this because it's due to be adopted by June 1 of 2022. So that is the operative date that Ridgefield is also working on. The statute indicates that such plan shall specify how the municipality intends to increase the number of affordable housing developments in the municipality, and so that is the focus and the direction that the state has directed. And as Dave indicated, the plan will need to be updated every 5 years in the future. So a plan of conservation and development is updated every 10, and this plan is every 5, so that's sort of an indication that the state is placing on these documents. Now, studying housing in Ridgefield is not new. The town has been involved in understanding and addressing affordable housing issues for the past, at least the past 25 years. The Blue Cover Report, I believe, is from 1999, and the housing study by the League of Women Voters is from 2014. So these issues have been looked at before. And in fact, when we go back to the plans of conservation and development from the 1960s all the way through to the most recent one in 2020, housing has always been a component of the plans in terms of issues facing Ridgefield at that time. In the 1960s and 70s, it was the explosive growth that was happening in town. One of the facts that always fascinated me about Ridgefield is that in the 60s, the town was building an elementary school every year because that's the kind of growth that was going on. So the plans need to be relevant to the issues of the day. So why prepare an affordable housing plan? There's a couple of reasons. First of which is the state has told us to. And secondly, everybody needs housing, so understanding what people's housing needs are is important. And everybody needs housing that's affordable, that they can afford. It's available when needed. Having a house available in 2 or 3 years couldn't work for people. And one that provides options and choices for people depending on where they are in their lives. And people benefit from having housing that's available to them. In a survey, a statewide survey, 43% recognized that housing and the diversity of housing choices provides 43%, highlighted that it provides individual stability and security. 18% talked about protecting themselves from rising rents. 17% identified housing as a way for wealth accumulation. And others commented on leaving something to future generations, better educational opportunities, and better health outcomes. So housing plays an important part in all aspects of our lives. And for people who have housing, they accept it that they have housing. But for people who struggle with housing, there can be significant issues there as well. There are many ways that the community benefits from housing as well. It provides housing options for people throughout their lives. So they might be born in one kind of house, and then as they grow up and go to school or college and first jobs have other housing, and then as they go through life, larger housing, trading up, and then perhaps at a certain time in their life, trading back down again to a smaller home. So having these kinds of housing options are helpful for people for their whole lives. It promotes community togetherness, and it also promotes a stronger economy. So housing is a key element of Ridgefield and other communities as well. Now, often there's a misunderstanding about what affordable housing is. And the way the state defines affordable housing is, I think, important just to touch on so that we recognize what we're talking about here. So for anybody in this room, or anybody generally, housing is considered to be affordable if you spend less than 30% of your income on it. Now, if you're earning a significant amount of money, you may choose to spend more than 30%, and you could afford to do so. If you're earning the median income or less, now housing, if it's more than 30% of your healthcare, education, and other things in life that some people just take for granted. So when the state talks about affordable housing and thinking about affordable housing, what they're talking about is housing which is at 80% or less of the median income for the area. And for Ridgefield, a family of 4, the median income is considered to be the Ridgefield region, okay, the area. There's a median income is $102,000, and so 80% is $82,000, and 60%, which is another threshold, is at roughly $60,000. So this is the type of situation that could be typical wages for people. You think about people who may work locally, maybe hourly, 2 wage earners, that this $82,000 is probably 2 people working full-time at $20 an hour or more. And how can they afford housing? So that's the first thing, is to think about income levels that this refers to. And then the second thing is what people or housing units could sell for to be affordable to people with those income levels. Whoops, I'm sorry. So when we go through the mathematics, which are defined by the state in terms of calculating this, generally speaking, we're talking about rents which would have to be below about $1,300 to $1,700, but let's just talk about $1,500 roughly as being those numbers. In Ridgefield, the median rent is about $1,700, so it's close. We're kind of in the ballpark. It's not too bad. But when we look at sale prices and go through the math, even today, at historically low interest rates, the sale prices that people can afford based on those income levels are somewhere in the $200,000 to $300,000 range. The leading housing price in town is $650,000. So there is a housing cost challenge in the community overall, and that's what's being looked at. Now, the issue of housing affordability has also grown and changed over time. This is a chart comparing income to house price, median income to median sales price of houses from 1968 to 2020. And generally speaking, that this rule of thumb, which is about a ratio about a little over 3 times, right? Your house is 3 times your income, if you will. So back in the 1960s, housing was relatively affordable, even at interest rates at that time, because the sale price of a house was sort of in a close ratio to what people's incomes were. But ironically, as the baby boomers, who in this room is a baby boomer? Hi, everybody. We'll have a group meeting after. But as people in the baby boom generation started to come into the age categories where they were interested in buying houses, what happened was it started to put pressure on the housing market faster than the market could respond. And as a result, we started to see a rise to the rule of thumb area of affordability. It fluctuated over time. Anybody remember WIP inflation now? Yeah, political statement in the 70s, etc. But what we see now is that really since about the turn of the century, that housing spiked and the housing boom which crashed in 2006. Here we are again, and this data only goes to 2018 and is missing the COVID bump, which has come along and continued. So generally speaking, housing used to be readily affordable. So for some people in this room, I'm not dating anybody, but it's quite possible your first house could have been readily affordable at the time that you bought it. But imagine today coming into a market where in fact the median house price is up to $650, and the challenge that can create in terms of housing affordability. So the world has changed. Affordability has become a greater concern overall. And actually, Ridgefield on the map.
Glenn, I'm sorry, could you move the microphone around? Thank you.
Thank you. I guess getting lazy as I went. So we talked about the rule of thumb, affordability, and Ridgefield's ratio based on this data. The most recent data was available. The ratio is up over 4. It is higher in San Francisco and other places around the country, but that's their problem. We have our own set of issues here. So the bottom line I wanted to kind of impress upon you is that more and more people are finding it harder and harder to be able to afford housing. It may or may not be a crisis. You might read in some of the magazines, you know, the housing crisis, etc. But it is a concern in Ridgefield, and it's a concern at the Affordable Housing Committee, because it includes people who already live here, who are struggling with the cost of living. The United Way does a study of communities around the state, what they call their ALICE study. And so ALICE, up here, I know you can't read that, I apologize. ALICE is an acronym for asset limited, so people don't have a lot of savings, if you will. Income constrained, so they're not making a whole boatload of money, but they are employed. So asset limited, income constrained employed is ALICE. And there's 22% of the population in Ridgefield, people who live here today, who fall into the ALICE category or below. So they're below the poverty level, or they're earning more than the poverty level, but less than the basic cost of living. So almost 1/5 or 1/4 of our population in Ridgefield today is already struggling with the cost of housing. And then when we go into the census data section, start looking at what's happening, what we find is about 31% of all Ridgefield households are housing cost burdened. And what that means is they're spending more than 30% of their income on housing. Now, realistically, if they're earning $75,000 or more, you can see that there's about 15% that are spending more than 30% of their income. So perhaps that could be a choice, correct? But if you're earning less than $75,000, somewhere between 80 and 100% of those households in Ridgefield are housing cost burdened today as owners, or somewhere between 77 and 92% if they're renters are housing cost burdened. So these are people who live here today and already struggling with the cost of housing. Now you might say that affordability doesn't really affect you, or doesn't affect Ridgefield that much. I'd just like to suggest a couple of things to help you think about ways that it might. The median age in Ridgefield has gone from 30 in 1960 to 45 in the year 2020. Now what that means, median age means half the population is older and half the population is younger. Now if the median age is getting older, hello baby boomers, right? That's us. We're living longer, healthier lives than generations before us did, so we're accumulating in the upper age groups, yes. But the other reason is partly because younger people can't afford to buy here. They can't afford to live here because the housing's not available. So we're not becoming an assisted living facility, but our median age is changing the dynamics in terms of what's going on in town. School enrollments are declining or decreasing for a reason, and other things are also going on in terms of the mix of municipal services. Now, as I indicated to you, I also had a chance to work on Ridgefield's town plan in 1999. And as I studied the data for that, I observed in the journey to work information, this means where do Ridgefield residents work, and where do workers in Ridgefield come from. And what we have every day, I joke, is the tide coming in and going out. Ridgefield residents tend to work south and west, so they leave town every day in that direction, and the workers who come in come from the north and east. When people in town say, well, geez, traffic's a problem. Part of the reason is because 100% of our population is changing over on a regular basis, or going places, or doing things. So the fact that we don't have affordable housing can affect traffic and traffic flows. And the second thing is that I'm sure you've seen signs around town, help wanted. And the reason is, it's hard for businesses to hire workers if in fact they have to commute long distances to get here. So just some things to think about. Now in terms of our housing stock overall, about 80% of Ridgefield's housing stock is single-family detached homes on lots, and about 20% is townhouses or condominiums or multiple unit types of buildings. And compared to the county and the state, our housing mix is overrepresented in single family and doesn't have as much diversity in other types of housing. And the reason the Baskin Robbins logo is up here, because Baskin Robbins has 31 flavors of ice cream. But Ridgefield doesn't need 31 flavors of housing, but perhaps we can have more. If we were all to go to Baskin Robbins today, some people would want vanilla, some would want chocolate, butter pecan, pistachio, all the choices and flavors. But in Ridgefield, 80%, it's like soup Nazi or whatever, right? that we end up in a situation is no soup for you, no housing for you, depending on what we have available. So housing diversity is a way to help address the housing needs of a variety of people. 86% of Ridgefield's housing is owner-occupied, and again, at $650,000 median price, less affordable. 14% of housing is rental and more affordable, but there are fewer units. Compared to the county, we have about a half, or maybe 40% of what the county and the state have in terms of other types of housing. I don't think Ridgefield has to match what the state and the county do, but perhaps other types of housing choices or options might be a good thing. The state keeps a tabulation about the number of affordable housing units in municipalities around the state. And the Department of Housing credits Ridgefield with 287 state-recognized affordable units. You have to recognize that this number is changing all the time for a couple of different reasons. There's 175 what are called assisted housing units, and these are mostly the Ridgefield Housing Authority projects in town, the developments and units which they own and manage. There's 69 deed-restricted units, 36 units where people, low and moderate income purchasers have gotten a Chfa Mortgage, which allows them to have a smaller down payment or a preferred interest rate, etc. There's also 7 units in town which are rental assistance unit, where people receive financial assistance from the state. And so all of these, at this time, are the most recent state report, credit Ridgefield with 287 units. And that, just going back for a second, that percentage is 3% of our housing stock. The reason that that's significant is that perhaps I've heard people referring to this term. Everybody heard of 830G? So the basic premise of 830G, the state decided back in 1989, so that's 30 years ago, the state decided that if a community has less than 10% of its housing stock meeting those criteria that I just described, that developments which are providing affordable housing and meeting certain criteria do not have to comply with local zoning. They can only be denied for reasons of public health and safety. So Ridgefield is not at the 10%. We're subject to 830G. Because of production that occurred within the community, we got enough what are called housing unit equivalent points to get a 4-year moratorium back in 2014, but that's 4 years, and guess what? It expired in 2018. So now we're subject to 830G again until we can produce more units or get to 10%. So it's just something to keep in the back of your mind overall. So now we get a chance to kind of get to the synthesis a little bit, and I think what the Affordable Housing Committee is pondering is what can we do and what should we do? And so the first step, as the state has indicated here, is let's prepare a plan. So the potential housing vision that the Affordable Housing Committee is pondering is a goal statement, perhaps, seek to provide a variety of housing choices in Ridgefield for people and families of all ages, income, and characteristics, and strive to become a more complete community. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. The strategies which are being contemplated, and why we're here tonight to get your thoughts and feedback on, are fall into a couple of different categories. Oops, I'm sorry. So the first of which is continue to implement the plan of conservation and development. We're not starting from scratch with a lot of these strategies. Some of these strategies have been in the plan of conservation and development for 10 or 20 years, and they're certainly in the 2020 POC. Look at ways to increase assisted housing, as I described earlier. That's sort of what the housing authority is responsible for. Look at ways to increase deed-restricted housing, and that's the way that we've gotten a moratorium through the production of units. Look at ways to increase overall housing diversity, even if it doesn't meet the state criteria. Maybe we could have more Baskin-Robbins flavors of housing. And then also paying attention to design. That's been an important issue. Now in the POCD, there is a chapter called Guide Residential Development, and the sort of major premise of that is to address housing that is affordable. So many of these strategies in here, and I know the text is small, and I apologize for that, not readable from the back. It will be an eye test for people in the back of the room later. But this document's available on the town website. I urge you to go look at it. But many of these strategies here are about the need for diversifying our housing portfolio, looking for ways to try to promote the creation and construction of additional types of affordable housing units, seek to retain these restricted units for a longer period so the affordability restrictions do not expire. You'll notice down here the red text are action steps, and one of the action steps is what we're doing here today, which is prepare an official affordable housing plan as required in the statutes. So these strategies are in place today, and I think the current sense is that we're going to continue or recommend continuing in that direction. In the Plan of Conservation Development is also a map of Ridgefield. So what we have here, Route 7 is right over here. Here's Branchville down here. Here's Ridgefield Center. This is the intersection of Route 7 and 35. Ridgebury is up here. High School is right there. So I think hopefully that gives you, the line is over here. So that gives you a sense of Ridgefield. The plan identifies these blue areas. The blue areas here in the POCD are called Potential Housing Opportunity Focus Area. Based on existing or potential sewer service areas, these areas are meant to be illustrative of potential locations for affordable housing or housing opportunity rather than definitive. Because services are available here or train stations are available here, the general thinking, the adoption of the POCD, is these would be the areas of town which are most suitable for this type of housing in the future. Now with 830G, people can propose housing anywhere in the community. But I think our thought is to try to advocate for approaches that would encourage housing that would help support the town center and provide for housing in a walkable, pedestrian-friendly type of environment, and also where transit's available. There are other strategies related to assisted housing. Assisted housing is housing which receives financial assistance from the government, the state or federal government, generally speaking, and also housing occupied by persons receiving rental assistance. And so this is generally housing provided by sort of three entities. The Housing Authority is one, but the other can be nonprofit or for-profit developers who receive state or federal funding in exchange for providing affordable housing. The financing requires this. And so there are ways, I think I indicated, if I remember the number correctly, I think it's 175 units that we have in town. And perhaps there could be ways for us to investigate how to do this, much as we've done this before. We've done 175 units before. So that's one flavor that the Affordable Housing Committee is thinking about. And another one is this concept of deed-restricted housing. And deed-restricted housing, affordable, assisted housing, as I was just talking about, is generally housing that is going to stay affordable for an extended period of time. Deed-restricted may expire. It can be encouraged, enabled, incentivized, or required as part of new development. The units are deed-restricted to people earning 80% or less of the income, and some percentage of units. It's generally around 10, 20, or 30% of the units that fall into this category. And the state statutes indicate that the deed restriction should be for at least 4 years, or perhaps even longer. And then there's a separate box here for what's called a set-aside development. In this box, planning and zoning rules can apply. We can set what those rules are, but we might encourage affordable housing. Over here, the developer can file an application, doesn't necessarily have to comply, provided that they meet some of these criteria. So these are the developments that can occur in places and ways that we may not favor. Another strategy is looking at ways to increase overall housing diversity. Some families, their circumstances have changed, whether it be through divorce or death or other situations, kids graduating from high school, empty nesters, etc. We can have older households downsizing, younger people or families starting out looking for housing, smaller units for smaller households. Census data tends to show that about 60% of the housing units in communities are occupied by 1 or 2 people. And again, some of the houses in town are perhaps larger than might normally happen for 1 or 2 people. And more housing choices which are less expensive. And so perhaps there might be ways in Ridgefield that we can encourage encourage other types of housing flavors to address other types of housing needs, and just so people can have choices. It might vary by size, by cost, by tenure, amenities or maintenance or other things like that. We've talked with the Affordable Housing Committee the concept of how important design can be. And what we've talked about is some types of housing that might be appropriate for Ridgefield and certain places, provided the design is good. It could be what are called cottage courts or pocket neighborhoods, or small two-family or small apartment buildings, mixed-use buildings. And here we have examples of buildings in Ridgefield already, which contain affordable units and seem to fit into the fabric of the community. Perhaps we can emulate and do more of those in the future. And many people have concerns about the concept of affordable housing. So I would encourage anybody who does have concerns to do some additional research. There are some wonderful sources out there. The National Low-Income Housing Coalition contains a lot of information to address common concerns with regard to affordable housing. AARP has put together a wonderful booklet called Making Room, Housing for a Changing America. And it's not just about retired people, but it talks about the changing age demographics and composition. And the things that we grew up with aren't necessarily all the realities today that our kids face. So there's some great publications out there to look at. The Partnership for Strong Communities, which is a Connecticut-based organization that does quite a lot of advocacy for housing-related issues in the state, has a page with frequently asked questions. And again, these types of questions in terms of taxes and why is it good for our town, etc., may answer some questions that you may have. This is just a sample of what they have. Some people are concerned about density and say, well, the project is too dense, or affordable housing is too dense. And the issue that we talked about in the Affordable Housing Committee is density is just a number. It's a way of measuring something in terms of units per acre. But actually, it's really the design which is more important than just the number. I tried to find a good paired image for tonight's presentation that had the same density and different designs. And unfortunately, what I was able to find was examples such as these, which are aerial images. They don't really sort of anticipate what people see from the ground. But the issue is, in a sense, you could see developments of similar density and you would visually prefer one over the other. And it really is an issue of the importance of design and not to focus quite so much on density. And density can be appropriate in some places. For example, the town center is denser than Ridgefield, and there's good reason for that. Property values. People are concerned that lower cost housing can have an impact on the neighborhood. Trulia, like perhaps you've heard of, a national real estate app, I guess we'll call it, or software program, did an investigation in the nation's 20 least affordable housing markets. Low-income housing built during a 10-year span showed no effect on nearby home values. So they tracked this in 20 metro areas with their database, and this is what they discovered. So I think there are examples from Trulia, for example, that as they titled their study, there doesn't go to the neighborhood. People sometimes are also concerned about school enrollments, and school enrollments are an interesting situation. Nationally, with this information from the National Association of Home Builders, single-family detached houses have the highest school enrollment impact per unit. It's about 60 students per 100 units, whereas multifamily, the impact is less than half of that. Also in Ridgefield, enrollments have been decreasing. The 2021 system-wide enrollment was 0.5 pupils per housing unit in the community. So we're even lower than what the national average is for single-family houses, partly because, again, of our age demographics, et cetera, overall. So again, the strategies which are being considered include continuing to implement the POCD, look at ways to increase assisted housing, look at ways to increase deed-restricted housing, look at ways to increase overall housing diversity, and pay attention to design. So those are the directions that the committee has been thinking about going, and we look forward to your comments, questions, and other information here tonight. So So I'm going to be scripting as we go here. All I would ask is put your hand up so I can recognize you. Try to catch up with my notes. Just a sec. And stand up, right? Because that opens up your diaphragm, and then people are going to hear you much better. And then hopefully I won't have to run around with the microphone. So I think the gentleman in the red here.
Sorry, I didn't know you minutes to look at my son's school. But I'm just curious if you could put a number up that, so I'm sorry, Sean Connolly, I'm our board selecting here. You put a number up that our affordable housing about 3%, as far from 10%. You know how that's changed over time? Or you say you've been working on this, we've been talking about this for a long time. Just curious how that number has moved up and been stable over time.
It has fluctuated and changed over time. So the public, the 830G was first adopted. The affordability period was 20 years, and then it got changed, and the affordability percentage also changed. So Ridgefield did have the creation of some units that have since retired, and so that fluctuates over time. The number of units which are Chfa Mortgage and rental assistance also fluctuate over time. But generally speaking, the units which are assisted housing, like the Housing Authority, these are financed long-term. Those tend to stay steady. So there are fluctuations. We've actually talked about the concept maybe of mapping this out so people can see that, if we take our eye off the ball, we're probably going to lag behind or lose some units. So that's a great question. Yes, it does change over time. Yes,
So a follow-on question. I'm Rick Stowe, and I sit on the Ridgefield Historic District Commission. I know that naturally occurring affordable housing does not count for purposes of 830G, but if you added those units in, where would we be? That's part one. Part two is, if we adopted a plan, would there be some vision for advocacy to sort of mandate 30G to include such types of housing?
great question. So the concept of naturally occurring affordable housing, the state only counts housing if it is restricted in some way, shape, or form. So those four categories I mentioned are considered restricted. One, because it's financed by state or federal funds, and the mortgage requirements tied into affordable restricted. The second is deed restricted, and that has a restriction on the land records that requires that the units be sold or rented at affordable prices for 40 years. That's a deed restriction on the land records, so that counts. The next category is what's called Chfa Mortgage. These are income qualifying households that get a mortgage and bonus on the land records, and so it counts under the state's calculus as an affordable unit for that purpose. And then the fourth category is rental assistance. These are lower income households where the state makes up the difference between what they can pay and what the unit rents for. Because of the rental rates in Ridgefield, we only have 7 of those units, right? That people can get more house in another community, so they go there. So we don't get credit for if somebody goes somewhere else. And then the Chfa, again, it's $650,000 for a median house, so it can be a little challenging to qualify for those. So a naturally occurring affordable housing unit is one that sells or rents at an affordable price, but because it's not deed restricted, it doesn't count. Now, I've been an advocate over the years that we should try to figure out ways to get those to be counted. And if the market goes ballistic and the units are no longer affordable, then our percentage drops slightly. But they are affordable, so why don't we let them be counted? So I think advocacy is something that could be considered for that as part of our effort. But that has been attempted multiple times over the past 30 years, and it hasn't happened yet. So I'm going to come back to you. I just feel like I'm favoring this side of the room because you guys are closer, so I see you. So I'm going to start over here and then come back. Yes, sir.
Question, please, about the process. So this is working backwards. The plan is due by June 1st next year to the state. If I recall from your very first slide up there, timeline, mentioned May of this year, the vote. Can you explain, please, again, what is going to be voted on, who is going to vote on it, what are the consequences of that vote, and if the vote in fact turns down the plan, what are the consequences of not giving it to the state June 1st next year? My point is that cutting it too tight? If your plan is voted down and that's going to be what's going to be voted on in May,
think it's unlikely the plan would be voted down because we're not going to simply present it at the end for approval. It's an inclusive process. The Board of Selectmen, Planning and Zoning will be apprised and have input on what's going all along. There's a preliminary session, preliminary presentation. We will receive input. So when there is the final meeting, there will be something that there's a very strong sense that unless there's a surprise, they will approve.
So it's a public meeting?
Yes. Oh, this is a...
Whoever attends, town vote, or there's only person vote?
Well, maybe Bob can help answer that. This is the Board of Selectmen have to vote on it. I suppose they can determine the process by which they vote on it, and Planning and Zoning will also have a voice in it. Bob, did you want to answer that?
Well, yeah, the Board of Selectmen will vote, but what we're not talking about here are the mandates that are coming down from the state. And we don't have any control over those mandates. So if they say, our representatives and state senators say, this is what we're going to do, here are the mandates. It's just like your 830G, you spoke about that. And, you know, you put it in a great light, but we're only at, 4%, and we're never going to get to 10%. This is never going to happen. But that's a mandate. As long as we have that mandate, we're going to be under the, as long as we don't, so if we don't hit that 10%, we're going to be subjected to the 830G mandates and everything else that Hartford throws at us. So, yeah, there's a lot of things that Board of Selectmen and Planning and Zoning can vote on, but this isn't one.
I think just a couple of things. I think the process, as Dave indicated, is meant to be very inclusive. So we're, bless you, we're pulling the schedule right now for the draft plan to be ready in January, which would leave the entire springtime for public input and comment, because tonight is the beginning of the dialogue, not the end. I think as the gentleman just indicated, member of the Board of Selectmen, we are dealing also with shifting scenes here. In this past legislative session, the legislature adopted some fundamental changes to state zoning enabling acts and other things, which also affect all of this. And so we're trying to do the best job we can for the town in this scenario. And there could be additional mandates that may come in from the town.
Will your meeting tomorrow night be recorded and available on the town website?
Yes.
I promise you next. Yes, go ahead.
So how many more units do we need to get to our 10%?
I think as the gentleman indicated, I think 10% should not be our ultimate goal, if you will. We're over 9,000 units in Ridgefield today. We're close to 9,500. So that's 950 units, and we're at 257 today. So the challenge we have is that for us to add units, that's a lot of units, right? That's more units than we've added in a decade or 20 years. So I think the goal should be for us to be cognizant of 830G, how it could affect us, but work incrementally and purposefully to try to diversify housing choices in ways that work for Ridgefield. I think we should try to make units that are deed-restricted be deed-restricted perhaps in perpetuity instead of this 4-year thing, or look at other things. So I think if we obsess on the numbers, we're going to feel like we're failing and we're not getting anywhere. And I think if we focus on addressing housing needs, we could make measurable progress. So I'm going to try to ping pong here back and forth, okay? Just because otherwise I keep sort of looking over here. Yes, ma'am?
Hi, Chfa Mortgage. So, if we say that we are never going to attain 10%, then we're shooting in the dark. At this rate, if builders only have to put in 10, 20% affordable housing, they're continually increasing the base of which we have to reach 10%. So that by nature is a fallacy. So, but to say that we cannot get 950 units, when we're talking about a 150 unit building, so then put in, see, people keep making it seem like we don't want affordable housing for people who make around $100,000 a year, but that's not true. What we're concerned about is the density okay? And I have yet to hear you answer what you're doing about the traffic. Because no matter what the mandate, there is gridlock. We can't even get a don't block the box. So at any time, and you all know this, there is no room for any more cars. So aside from the fact that you're saying we should just accept the mandates, not okay. Aim for 950. What does it take? And put the units in multi-family zones and don't block them in the middle of a 2-acre zone neighborhood where they don't belong. Put them in town. I'm trying to be respectful, but I've asked you guys on Facebook. The town is impassable. I've been here for 35 years. And this is a disgrace. Yes, we need affordable housing. We need these buildings. They're beautiful the way you paint them. But they don't look like that. And we don't have a problem with people. I don't make a lot of money. Like, I could go in one of those units. This is not about low-income housing. But we need answers and not being told that we are not going to reach that 10%. Because what you're saying is that we have to do what the government says. They can do 830G till ad nauseum. Come up with a plan. You've been on this for 25 years. I've been watching you. So where are we and why has nothing changed? Well, I'm sorry. There's no... What you have done. He asked about 3%. And he said, what have we done in these past years? Why is that 3% not much?
So I think we're going to go back, and we're actually going to document, if you will, the progress that has been made, and then perhaps lost over time due to the retirement of units. If it's the community's will to go for 950, we'll go for 950.
Go for it. Then we reach it, and then there's no more discussion.
Got it. Aim for 950.
Glenn, if I might.
Yep.
So if you do the math, you end up that we are, as of today, 655 units short. And it's pretty ridiculous to think that we're going to build 655 units here within the next couple of years. It's not going to happen. 655 affordable units. A couple of things. They don't have to be done under 8-30G. There's a conception that all development has to be 30%. No, we can build 100% affordable. And that would change the equation quite a bit. We can also, and I'm going to turn this back to you here, if you don't mind. So we, smile, you're on TV. We can also, lost my thought, where was I?
Well, it's really concerning the traffic, like capacity.
Oh, right. So there's the moratorium, right? You only need a certain number of what Glenn explained are housing equivalency units to get you to the next moratorium. And that requires adding a certain number of housing equivalent points. We are along the way to our next moratorium, and if, for example, this Prospect Ridge project were to be developed, it would get us, depending how many units are built, most or all of the way to that moratorium. Now, the last time we had a moratorium, we just said, hey, we got a moratorium, we don't have to sweat about it. And 4 years later, when the moratorium expired, there was a backlog of projects, and all of a sudden people saw these projects blooming all over the place and saying, we're being overrun. Part of that is because we did not tackle the problem during the moratorium. But if we can go from moratorium to approach moratorium, maybe we can get to that 10% in a slow, smart, and planned way.
Right. But I believe somebody had asked, I thought it might be Robin, but we had asked if that 150-unit building would apply towards affordable housing, and I could have sworn somebody said it would not apply.
I don't know who said that. It would apply 100%.
So 150 units, whatever it is.
Yeah. Now, I also want to add, it's not going to be 150 units. That number, and I hear people saying that all the time, that number was based on if we used the maximum of the property to full capacity. It's not going to be near that. We'll talk about that at tomorrow's meeting. But it's
Let's just try to keep trying to be equitable here. So I'm going here, over there, then you're next. Again, do we go here? So we got the next four speakers. Go, sir.
I think I'll go back to the process question.
Stand up.
I'm sorry. I can go back to the process question. Is town meeting, I think you're running a real risk, because the May town meeting may have 150 very opinionated people that will vote it down. Then what happens? I mean, that's, again, if you're relying on a May town meeting, it's scary.
I'd love to weigh in on that. First of all, any time the town buys, sells, or leases a property, it has to go to the town. It has to go to the town for a vote. Townspeople into a town meeting, and then the townspeople will vote on it. For example, a couple of weeks ago, at the Board of Selectmen meeting, there was a transfer of property from, to the conservation. People come in and they actually vote on it. We signed the lease at town-owned property. The residents come and they have to vote on it. So the particular property that people are concerned about right now is the 150 units. They know that we have control of that property, correct? Big prospectors around there?
No.
So you don't have control of that property. So that if we were to sell that property to a developer or lease it or give it away, the town's going to have to vote.
But this is the plan, not a selling a property. Because again, I appreciate if you're doing something in a town where it's no, and it stops. But now we've got a May vote with a June deadline. So what happens?
That's
Yes, I'm worried about the May vote, not the town. It's not the selling.
this is the plan of conservation that the development is talking about.
Well, it's the
Then there's
affordable
a
housing
separate
plan.
issue, which is the proposal that he put forth, that David and the Affordable Housing Committee put forth on a 150 unit affordable.
No, this is the main plan. That plan has to go to the,
Board of Selectmen.
yes.
And there, I don't know if it's required approval from planning and zoning, but we will certainly seek approval.
But it's not town.
That's not a town meeting, but the Board of Selectmen need to approve it. How they choose to approve it is up to them. I don't know if a town meeting is required or a referendum is required. But Bob, correct me if I'm wrong, you can decide to make it a vote or make it a public vote or simply do it as a Board of Selectmen vote.
On the plan of conservation?
No, on the affordable housing plan.
On affordable housing plan? I would submit that that's going to go to
Yeah.
Yeah, that's tough to go. Because again, you have like 150 people show up at these meetings and it can go down pretty quickly and then we're not going to be compliant.
There's a requirement in statute for the affordable housing plan to have a public hearing, whoever the adopting entity is. So some towns are doing Board of Selectmen, some towns are doing planning and zoning. I've not heard anybody doing town meeting. Some towns have town councils are doing town councils. So I do think that this is up to Ridgefield to figure out how it wants to approach it. And I think the plan will be ready in January and we'll figure that out as we go. So I think yes, you ma'am. Oh, sorry. In the back. Yes, there you go. Thank you.
I want to go back to what the lady said. When you have a plan, you're going to have 5 years plan. What are the tangibles? What do you think? What are the deliverables in those 5 years that you're going to propose? Because if we need not 50, we cannot get that 50. That's your 5-year plan proposed to get that over 10 years. 5 years, 2 years? So what are the tangibles of that plan apart from continue to implement, look at ways to reduce? Will you be asked to have something more complete than?
I think the Affordable Housing Committee, based on the conversations I have had with them so far, is to move in that direction to be as specific as possible. So there could be recommendations to other boards for regulation changes. There could be recommendations to other boards to acquire property or to promote certain types of things. So the tangibles, I think, will be specific recommendations. Because the 5-year outlook, from what I've seen around the state, is to promote action. And that, within, let's say, 4 years or 5 years from now, we'll be into the update of that plan in terms of what are our next steps. So what do we make progress on, et cetera. Am I answering your question?
Yes, but I'm not sure I like the answer because you're saying we would have
hard to answer that question.
You know what I'm saying?
I think so.
And from the state perspective, if it's a requirement,
So we're in the early stages here. At the same time that the state adopted this public act in its most recent legislation, there was a section in that act which created a commission, a state commission or committee on Connecticut's future, something like that. And part of their charge is to evaluate what ways for communities to implement those affordable housing plans. Now, does that mean that they're going to be monitoring what communities do? I don't know yet. This is still up in the air. So I think, as we've talked about here, the first step is what does Ridgefield feel it can and should do? And we'll get started on that, and we'll see what unfolds as time goes on. Thank you. I think I'm sorry, there's a guy right back here, and I'll get you an answer, okay? Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I want to thank you for a really good presentation at the beginning of this meeting. It was very informative. My question is the parcel where the 150-unit apartment building is supposed to go, is that open space currently? I'm hearing online that it is. Is that designated open space, and are we going to change the zoning for that parcel to be residential?
We'll talk more about that parcel tomorrow. As I understand it, that parcel is...
That brings up my second point, which is we can't get information, accurate information about what the agenda is, when the meetings are happening, and who's in attendance. So is there one place, centralized place, where we get, because I came here tonight to talk about the 150-unit bridge, and then all of a sudden the agenda's changed to something else. That meeting is tomorrow.
No,
By the way,
I'm sorry, please.
Where's the best
All right.
place to get information about what's going on, so that there's
Sure.
no bait and switch, which I feel is what's happening tonight. There's no bait and switch in the future. I just want it really clear, so that everybody in this room can have a chance to understand what the issues are, vote on the issues, make their issues known. Because there's a lot of, in my opinion, sneaky stuff. Yeah, so what about that?
It's the property is currently under the control of the Parks and Rec Department, so it will require approval from the state in order to do this. I don't know if the acreage that we're talking about is considered open space. It's not designated open space in the way that some properties have been. But we're looking at a small portion of that property, so it would not be the whole thing. But to answer your question, all meetings are noticed, and when they're noticed, there's an agenda. If there's no notice, it's because it's not a meeting. If there's no agenda, it's because it doesn't require an agenda. You will find everything at the town clerk's office. You'll also find much of it on the Facebook page. You can always find our minutes, and our meetings are public. You know, we're shooting for complete transparency. Tonight's session was entitled Public Information and Input Session on the Affordable Housing Plan, which to me sounds very clear. I'm sorry if somehow that was misrepresented or that wasn't what you understood.
The gentleman, I'm sorry. So just so everybody's clear, this gentleman here, then down front, and then the lady with the question. I got you. Now you're on that list.
Hold the mic close, please.
Thank you.
So as far as this plan is concerned, obviously I know, just from what I read online and hearing comments tonight, that people are concerned about the 830G statute. And I know a lot of people in this room, a lot of people online, myself included, kind of feel that is taken advantage of in a lot of ways. And we're looking, I think people are concerned and are looking for some guidance or a way that we can, it's never going to stop, obviously, especially if we're nowhere near the affordable housing number. But is part of this plan, is there anything in this plan to sort of counteract the 830G or respond to it? Because when people are saying we're never going to hit these numbers, or maybe
can address the town, but Glenn, how is that usually handled statewide? What is the state's response to earnest efforts by towns?
So the Public Act was adopted back in 1989. And over the past 30 years, there have been multiple attempts by municipalities in the state to get the law modified. There have been a couple of tweaks over the years, but generally speaking, the law has stayed intact. So the situation is that a developer submitting a compliant application. That means that 30% of the units are deed restricted for at least 40 years. Half of those units, 15%, are deed restricted at 80% AMI, and the other 15% at 60% of AMI. If the commission turns it down, it goes to court, and the court makes the decision. And I think there's at least one situation in Ridgefield where the court approved the development. So the only rationale for the town to be able to deny and have it stick in its head is that it's a substantial threat to public health or safety that cannot be overcome. I think there's quite a bit of history on the Eureka site, the application there in terms of the Saugatuck River watershed and the impacts on that. And so that was a significant issue there. So it's hard to talk decisively because it's moving ground. But I think that I have tried to write down your comments here in terms of what can we do about 830G. I do want you to know that, as Dave indicated, it could take us a long time to get to 950 units if we're at 257 today, whatever the number is. Okay?
287,
so that's quite a bit of units. But we can also get there by getting a moratorium, which requires we accumulate what are called, it's 2% of your housing stock. So just a rough number, okay? Don't hold me to it. But let's say it's 180 points. There are some units, for example, I think an elderly unit, you only get a half a point for. But if it's a unit at 60% of AMI, you can get 2 to 2.5 points per unit. So there's different levels that we could actually look at, figure out how many points we already have, and in that 4-year period, how do we get 180 points? Because that's 45 points per year. That could be 20 units of the right mix and do something like that. So there can be ways to get there, and that's something I've written down. We can certainly talk about that. So hang on a second here. I'll come back to you in a moment.
Wait, I just want to add on to that. You know, we hear a lot about 8-30G, and I have to remind people sometimes that we are not the 8-30G committee. But what we do believe, and I think almost everybody here will agree with this, if there's going to be affordable housing in Ridgefield, we want to do it our way rather than have it imposed on us. Now, some of those, and we're 100% with you, now some of those might be really nice 8-30G developments that the town agrees on and they're beautiful. Some of those might be public housing that we build. Some of those might be changes to the regulations. Some of those might be strategies like adaptive reuse, like to take that building next to the falling down warehouse next to Casey that used to belong to Ridgefield Supply. And look at that. There are a lot of creative solutions we can bring to it, including things like housing trust funds where we can raise money that can help give people incentives to deed restrict their existing properties so we're not necessarily having to build from scratch every 8-30G, every deed restricted property. But we have to work together, we have to come up with really solid ideas, and then we have to have the guts to implement them as a committee and not cry because it's too close to the dog park. I'm sorry, Glenn, I'm sorry, I apologize. Glenn is running the meeting, so.
Okay, Ben.
Thank you. My voice is a little off, so I apologize. I'm just curious, obviously, having an open process is what everyone wants. This is a long-term need, so we should be looking at this with long-term views, right? But yet, all I've heard is this one parcel at Prospect Ridge. Are we not talking about 3 or 4 options? Are we simply going forward the whole process, only looking at Prospect Ridge, and if that either passes or fails, we haven't had any discussion about anything else? It seems to me, if we have a long-term need that we're trying to address, then we should be bringing in some of those other blue areas that you've had on there, and And why are they not part of what we've heard so far? Because all I'm hearing are this one parcel of land that we're talking about. But yet it seems like the long-term strategy should encompass a much larger part of the community. In that area of the community, we already have, there's some elderly facilities, there's some disabled facilities, there's obviously traffic issues, it's a narrow street, et cetera, et cetera. If we're trying to create some density area, it seems like that would be something that could be a little challenging. No one wants that to be called Pottersville later on. So maybe we should have a more open thing. So let me ask, first of all, are there other things on the table to discuss outside of Prospect Ridge? If not, how the hell did we get pigeonholed into this one thing now with 4 or 5 months left to make a decision? And is that simply the horse that we're riding to the end of this? Or is there going to be some more consideration for the other blue areas?
So that's a great question, and there is some confusion, and that's a kind of a timing thing. It takes 4, sometimes 5 years or more to go from the planning or initial conception stage for an affordable housing development till you're finished. So if we wanted to wait until the end of the planning process to look at Prospect Ridge, we'd be losing a couple of years. So the Prospect Ridge project is completely separate from the plan. The plan is wide-ranging. As you said, it's looking at all solutions. It's looking at all areas of town. They're two separate things, and while they're related, they should not be confused with one another.
I don't understand then. Why is the dialogue all about Prospect Ridge? Why is there nothing about Branchville? Why is there nothing about other areas? It seems like we're single-threaded.
Sure.
So are we single-threaded?
No. We're just getting ready. We're just getting ready with the planning process. We're just getting started with this planning process right
So
now.
in this planning process, we're going to hear other properties brought.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So
It's
Prospect Ridge is one of many that we'll be discussing.
Yes.
Somehow we got focused on Prospect Ridge, and that was a mistake because it sounds like there's a much larger discussion that's going to happen between now and May or June of next year.
You're absolutely right. Yes.
I think as a planner, I wish I made those statements earlier. The main purpose of tonight's meeting is the bigger picture plan preparation. What should our strategies be? And Prospect Ridge is one element which is off to the side being investigated, but it's not central to this plan just yet, right?
Well, are there similar ones now also off to the side?
Not that I'm aware of, but I
So
think
we're
there's
single-threaded then outside the process.
I mean, the plan strategies can be focused on how we're going to get to the results, and whether it's on Buttercup Lane or Main Street or some other street in town, is something that we're going to get to later. Because I think the question is, and I think I've heard loud and clear, how are we going to get results here, whether it's a moratorium or an exemption?
So last point. So it seems like tomorrow, there's a meeting tomorrow that's specifically about Prospect Ridge.
No, it's not.
Thank you. What is it?
It's an affordable housing meeting. Prospect Ridge is one of 7 or 8 agenda items.
Is there more properties to be discussed outside of Prospect Ridge?
Absolutely. For example, all of Branchville is an important area.
And that's one of the things to be discussed tomorrow.
Well, the planning process is going to take us a while.
Is Prospect Ridge the only thing?
Absolutely not. It's just
what you're telling me is it is.
No, it's a complete.
What are the agenda items for the Branchville conversation?
Well, that will come up in the planning process, which is going to take place over the next 2 months or so. So, Branchville will be discussed, other properties in town will be discussed, other strategies in town will be discussed. That's a very separate thing from the Prospect Ridge project, which is on its own track.
But there's nothing else on its own track.
Well, not yet. But, for example, we've been talking about Branchville.
How did Prospect Ridge get on its own track? Why is that being in the crosshairs? What got us to this point?
This was an opportunity for us to get started with affordable housing that we know we're going to need.
It just happened to be the first one.
Yes.
Okay, listen, if that's what you're telling me, I'll believe you. I don't know. I'm asking the question.
challenging question to answer specifically, and I'm just going to give you a quick summary as to why. Oh, thank you.
I'm sorry. So I apologize for that. The best census data we have available right now, unfortunately, is from 2010. Okay?
Nobody did this.
Let me just, I understand. Let me finish. I get a chance to. It's for 2010, and that's 10 years old. The 2020 census has been delayed. There's some sense that it may have gotten messed up a little bit, so we have preliminary data, and so we don't have anything else. The only other thing that's out there that's available is what's called the American Community Survey. Does anybody here participate ever in the American Community Survey? Yeah. So what you did too? Wow, that's actually pretty good. Because what they do is they sample a small sample of the population each year and then estimate for everybody based on what you said. And so it's not very accurate. The margin of error is quite wide. We did a preliminary analysis based on the ACS data in terms of the number of units at different rents and sale prices. And we estimated that in terms of NOAA, naturally occurring affordable housing, I forget where that term first came out, we're somewhere near 10%. But it doesn't count.
So what would happen if we don't do anything? So we're near 10%. We know in our town we have a pretty diverse housing supply. And I'm not saying don't build it, but why this push? What are they going to do to us if we're not building it?
That's what representatives to decide.
All right, so hang on. We're not going to devolve into, yelling at whatever.
I was just curious because I know we have a pretty diverse market.
Well, there is diversity in housing prices, even in the non-affordable housing prices. There are houses that go from $650 up to several $1 million. So there's diversity. I understand. So the issue is there's not really enough housing to meet all of the needs in the community. And so how can or should we address that? I think that's what we're struggling with.
How do we determine the needs? Who determines the needs are more important than others?
So 31% of the housing units in town already are housing cost burden. At least 22% of the households in town today are in the Alice categories. These are people who live in the community. Never mind other people who may want to live in Ridgefield, but people who are here today that exceed the 10%. So we're at a shortage right now.
So what would fix that? I mean, right now we're getting ready for a reassessment. They're coming in and they're reevaluating our houses, so everybody's values are going to go up, which means their taxes are going to go up. So that 31% is now maybe going to become 40%. So they keep hitting us with these reevaluations and saying we have needs that we have to address. So it doesn't really pan out, And I don't know. Maybe let's deal with the root causes of the problems rather than just creating more problems.
Okay, thank you.
So anyway, I just wanted to do a little more on that.
Thank you.
Jack Welch, just want to address a comment that you made about open land. So Prospect Ridge is number 41. Open land is 36 acres total, and there's actually a trail that goes through there. You're looking at 15 acres, which actually cuts that trail right in half. So it is open space right now. It includes the ball fields and everything else as open space, but that is an open space area right now. And it is deeded that way. It was deeded that way when I moved in. It's deeded that way now. And they've talked about different things at different times in that for that property that we successfully fought. So hopefully maybe that'll happen again. But so the meeting tomorrow night, what's the plan for that? Is that a public forum? Or is that
It's not a public forum. It's a meeting of the Affordable Housing Committee. You can sign up, go to the town website, find it on the calendar, and register and attend. It's a webinar. There will be time for public comment at the end. We're only given 2 hours because we're using the webinar, the town's webinar account.
So when will be the first public forum for the Prospect Ridge project?
I don't know yet. We're still, all right. Where we are with Prospect Ridge right now is just determining the feasibility of building on that property. If we determine, or if it's determined by the engineers that it is feasible to build on that property, then the question is, what would be the impact of building on the property? So then we're doing a feasibility study, which will look at traffic, which will look at the market, which will look at the financial impact, which will look at schools, which will look at community services and infrastructure. Once we have information, then it's time to have the public discussion, because to have a discussion without information, that's like Facebook.
They're going to do all that by June.
No, we have no deadline for that project. It's as I said, that's a separate project on a separate track.
So if there's no deadline, it won't be part of the plan.
It'll probably be part of the plan at some point to say that's a property that should be considered, but depending on where we are, we'll see.
Can you please address the fact that I asked earlier?
So what didn't get answered earlier?
What I said is that the town is currently impassable with the current population. What are you going to do as you build more units to accommodate that?
Okay, I got that comment. There are other people who also want to be asking questions, so I'll come back to you.
But I asked it 20 minutes ago.
I can't answer a question about traffic tonight, but I wrote down traffic, so we're going to be considering traffic as part of our work.
You don't have any particular plans right now yet for how you're going to anticipate how that will be addressed?
You know, traffic's an issue no matter what happens. Housing could get built in Branchville and rely on the train station, and traffic would be less of an issue. Housing could be built in the town center that people would walk to places. So that's, if Prospect Ridge is, if we're doing a master plan on Prospect Ridge is an issue, traffic would follow after that. So I've written it down. It's something we need to think about, but we don't have answers tonight for that specific. So there's several hands up over here, so we can, yes ma'am. Yep, right there. Yep.
Susan Constantine, on planning and zoning. Glenn helped us with the POC. I sort of got elected halfway through that. He was really helpful with that. Would it be safe to say that what you're doing tonight would compare to how we were doing the POCD, and this is affordable housing? Because that has to be done every 10 years. We have to report it to the state. Because I think that there's a little bit of confusion about what's going on tonight. And if that's so, is that you're just collecting information. So we're all giving our suggestions now so they can be considered. Is it the same way we did our POC?
Yeah, I think, yes. I mean, at the beginning of the POC process, at that time, we did a townwide telephone survey. That's sort of the way we collected information.
People are also able to come in and make suggestions. So I think that from what I'm seeing, and I don't know, because I also was, thought I was here to hear about the prospect of thing, so I was confused as well. But if that's what's going on, if everyone here just gives their suggestions, that's why Glenn is writing it down, and he did such an amazing job with us with the POC. That if you give all your things, that those things are going to be discussed. Is that what you're trying to say, Dave? That you're going to discuss all those things, and that's why there isn't an answer for everything tonight. Does that help?
And one thing to add to that, the plan of conservation and development can be amended at any time. That's in the state statutes. And we hope that once the affordable housing plan is done, significant parts of that can be incorporated into the plan of conservation and development, which is now a little bit, well, necessarily vague when it comes to housing. We can be more specific.
And we are working on that. I'm on the subcommittee for that. We have a subcommittee of planning and zoning that we are addressing items on that PLC. And that's open, and everyone can watch that as well when that happens. So just also know that those of us that are working on planning and zoning we already are very aware of -3G, and we're all already thinking things we can do, and we hear you, hear all of you, and we're trying to look for some other ways to go about it that may not be just building, but there are other ways we are thinking and hard. So, thank you.
Anybody on this side? Go ahead, yeah.
Joseph Tobin. I just wanted to see if there was something we could do to change the rules for developers. Even though we have this on 830G, you said there's a 40-year moratorium, the low-income pricing expires in 40 years. Can we change that ourselves and just say it is forever, or it is 60 years, or is there anything we can do to make it a little less attractive?
economics in Ridgefield for the market rate units, make the affordable units an acceptable component of the project. I have to let you know that I think Ridgefield is part of a leader around the state, that the town has already adopted a model or standard housing affordability plan that requires that all developers use the same framework, if you will, for their deed restrictions. Came across this when I was working on the POCD and discovered that every affordable housing development that had ever been approved in town, everybody had a different plan. And you can imagine what it could have been like trying to administer, monitor, or manage this. So the town now has a standard plan. They have a list of approved third-party administrators. It doesn't have to be third-party, approved administrators of the affordability plan to qualify households and sale prices. So Ridgefield is getting procedures in place to manage affordable housing well. The question about the restriction period is a fertile area of discussion around the state right now. The state statutes say at least 40 years. And towns around the state are saying, well, hang on a second here. If every time, what's that Greek mythology, Sisyphus or something? Trying to roll the ball up the hill. So you make progress, right? We got 950 units. We were awesome. And then the next day, 100 of them retire. It's like, dang. 100 units again. So can we figure out a way to try to get good quality, affordable housing in town that will meet needs over the long term? And there are communities around the state that have adopted deed restrictions for the life of the unit or 40 years, whichever is longer. There's towns around the state that are looking at the situation and what happens when the deed restrictions expire. Because if I was to sell to you an affordable unit, and 40 years is ticking by, come year 40, his unit resets to market. Who gets the money? He does. We would all hope for that kind of price appreciation. So the question is, well, can the town capture part of that increment so that we can actually invest that money in another affordable unit? Why does somebody... we're learning as we go along. So I think that these are things that we're talking about as part of the affordable housing plan, is to get a cogent program in place, as this gentleman indicated, multiple facets to it that all kind of work together to improve the situation. And then 5 years from now, we can improve on that. And so I think that's our hope. That's our goal. Yes?
This is really, I think, a complicated subject that we're all trying to wrap our brains around. And we're conflating a lot of different issues. The POCD, Affordable Housing Commission, Committee, 830G. This is really confusing for people that don't do this as a living. I think everybody's done a great job tonight, but a lot of this has been number salad and word salad. Okay? I'm a simple person. I like simple concepts and simple ways to understand these things. And just to give you one of the things I think is very confusing is we talk about affordable housing. Well, what is affordable housing? What's affordable for you may be very different than what's affordable for you. I found a state here. Okay, I've been here 40 years. But what's causing Ridgefield and all the other towns around us to become unaffordable? And it's because of supply and demand, the limitation on land. I lived in Illinois, in Ridgefield, Illinois, before I moved here. It was 25,000 people. It was on the far western suburbs of Chicago. There were hundreds of thousands of acres, and they developed, it's now about 175, 200,000 people there. We don't have that. So it's supply and demand, and then it's the cost of doing business in this town. Okay, so when we talk about affordable housing, like I look at assisted housing. When I think of assisted housing, I think of assisted living. Okay, we have a new designation. It might not be new to you, but it's, we're missing a word in there. Look at ways to increase, financially assisted housing. That's what you're talking about. Financially assisted housing. So my concern is, and Dave, you know this, when my very first year on the Board of Selectmen, we reached Steve's here, we were both advocates of reconstituting the housing committee. And I said to you at that time, I'd like to see a study of all the housing, and then let's determine the type of housing. But I think there's a lot of skepticism now because we have an agenda being pushed out of the federal government and then at state government, and with all this financially assisted housing being built and pushed into these communities. So why can't, and these are mandates, and that was the point that I tried to make earlier. We're just assuming, and we have to accept these mandates, and we do, they're mandates, we have to accept them. But the problem is, we want to, as people that have invested in Ridgefield, we want the best for our community. Why can't we make our decisions on the type of housing that we need, the type of housing that we want? When I moved here, I started looking at houses in Darien. I couldn't afford it. And I ended up, thank goodness, because I love the town, I ended up in Ridgefield. But just because I want to live in Darien, or I want to live in Greenwich on the Long Island Sound, I can't. Okay, so, but we need to have control and not have an outside advocacy group demanding that we build financially assisted housing, because who's going to pay for that? Okay, we have to pay for it as the taxpayer. Hartford does not generate income. They take our tax money and then they figure out ways, and they're telling us how to spend it. And it's time to call it what it is, and let's start looking at housing that's affordable and needed and wanted in our community, and not housing that the mayor of New Haven or Hartford that they want to push down on top, push down on cars and do these.
So, I want to first apologize for any naivete on my part because half the time I don't know what you're talking about. But a couple things. We are faced with what is coming from the state, what they said we have to have. I don't particularly like that, but I think sometimes communities are enriched by things that people might avoid initially, and that's not always a bad thing. But when it comes to this process that I've been seeing here tonight, difficulty in getting kind of simple answers to questions, getting wrong answers to questions, it makes me kind of question the process. And so when I think of what I've gotten here tonight, and I may be wrong, what I've gotten here tonight is we're going to talk about this thing, but we're not going to talk about this thing, right? And the other thing is that the Prospect Ridge thing. Now, if we're talking about creating a plan for affordable housing or a plan to help with this issue that was not our plate, it was given to us by the state, but it's a reality of what we have, that rather than taking this opportunity of something that could be possibly 150 units toward the number that we have to make and thinking things more holistically, how could we bring other parts of the Ridgefield community together to study this issue and find other creative ways, holistically, not to put this project here and then forget about it, and then try to find another project here, and then that goes its own way, but thinking of all the projects that could happen, or all the places, or all the ways that could be addressed, and that's what I don't hear here. I mean, I'm hearing about we're putting together a plan, but I don't personally really understand what their plan is.
Okay, I think that's a fair question. Because Glenn, we haven't really talked about what must be included in the plan itself. Do you want to run down what will be in the plan?
Well, I think any good plan is going to statement of the issue that we're kind of grappling with. It's going to look at the available data, community input. We're talking about doing a survey. I think your question about involving the community and other strategies is likely to be a question that we might ask. And then put it together in terms of an organized strategic approach. I think as this gentleman indicated over here, you want to have several pages back, have your big picture vision, and then have your strategies underneath that. And they could be things such as regulation changes that aren't that exciting, but can actually over time make a big impact. They could be project related. I think developers, there may be ways to encourage or incent the creation of affordable housing, but not at the 30% level. Developers go to the 30% affordable because they have to get there because it's not otherwise approvable. Maybe we could craft a regulation, and I think the Commission has talked about this multiple times over the years. What could we do when some regulations that have been adopted haven't worked out the way that were intended? So I think the plan is likely to get organized in the basic explanatory approach to get to the strategies in terms of what would happen. So that's not a specific outline here. It's the
But specifically, it'll have the data and analytics. It'll look at the existing housing stock. It'll determine what the need is in town, and it'll look for different ways over time to address that need. It's not focused exclusively on 8-30G. It is looking more broadly at housing needs. For example, there are a lot of people, $100,000 and plus, who are housing cost burdened. For some of them, it's not an issue, but for some of them it is. So we're at the beginning of this process. We have a lot of data to gather. Once we have all of that, we'll lay out strategies and specific tactics about how we go through it. And Glenn gave some examples. Maybe there are some regulation changes. You know, the town just recently changed the rules for accessory dwelling units, accessory apartments. It's good. It's really good what they did. That's something that if it hadn't been done, we would recommend in the plan. So the plan is going to be a broad analysis and analysis of the affordable housing need in Ridgefield, or more broadly, all housing need in Ridgefield, and then to offer a prescription for meeting that need. Does that answer your question?
Exactly. The gentleman who's the cameraman in the back has been stating, oh, I'm so sorry, I'm sorry.
I will talk to you after. I will make sure.
I'm sorry, yes. Thank you.
Thank you. Colette Boscali, Realtor in town. So I know that we have very low inventory. I also know that we do need affordable housing, but I respectfully request that we have open forum like this for that 150 prospect, because there are a lot of questions that are not being answered, and when you have a back and forth, you get a lot more knowledge. Instead of having a webinar where we're cut off.
No, I promise you we will have that. Tomorrow's meeting is not a webinar about that. It's a regular Affordable Housing Committee meeting.
Can I ask you when you're going to put that out? Because I think people want to know now.
Put what out?
A public open forum regarding Prospect Ridge.
Once we have more information, which is why we're doing a feasibility study.
I think the problem was the feasibility study was done. We got $50,000 from the state to do a feasibility study on that particular property.
Right.
And you don't have control of that property. So you put the cart before the horse, and I think that is the issue a lot of people have.
Well, we were told by the Board of Selectmen that before they would consider, so that it's the cart before the horse and the horse before the cart. So the Board of Selectmen told us that they would not consider the property until we had done a feasibility study.
That's not true. The feasibility study, as I explained that, you brought before the Board of Selectmen a very specific plan. The specific plan that called for 150 units with X number of 80%, X number of 30, 60%, 40%, and so on. That was a very specific proposal that you brought. And yes, it was. I have it. Okay? Go to the tape. Steve was there. Okay? So that's what you get. There was
No. All right. Bob, that's misinformation. I'm sorry. It's misinformation, and I'll tell you why. Let me answer.
Let me finish.
I'm sorry, please, go ahead.
Okay.
I will.
Because I even said, how did I vote at that meeting? Do you recall?
You voted no.
And why did I vote no?
I don't recall.
Because it was a feasibility study on a specific program, a specific property, on a specific plan. And I said what we should be looking at was a marketing plan. First of all, we don't have control of the property. Okay, so if you're going to do a feasibility study, generally the protocol would be you would have control of the property. Then you do the study based on your proposal. And that's what that was done. It was a feasibility study, and that's what you were given the grant for.
Right, we were given the grant to do a feasibility study.
On your proposal.
No.
Your plan.
Bob, listen, you have the document there, that's fine, bring it up. It was a hypothetical distribution if, and I'm sorry to get into the weeds here, but there's a lot of misunderstanding about what's going on. We presented a proposal that said, here's what could be hypothetically built on it. But let us do a feasibility study to determine what could and what should be there. And we were specifically told by the Board of Selectmen that this was not approval to use the land, this was just approval to do the feasibility study. And once we came back with the feasibility study, then site control would be discussed. That's the way it was.
So, yes, that would have been, I hate to split hairs with here, but that's a market study that you probably should have done, not a feasibility study on a specific proposal.
The feasibility study is part of the market study. We haven't done the feasibility study yet.
Right.
We have done a limited site suitability study to decide if it's worth even going ahead because the site might be buildable. Bob, I'm sorry, let's continue this after because it's
$50,000 spent on the site.
it wasn't spent. We spent $3,000.
Okay, so you still have $47,000.
Yes.
About to suggest you guys go outside. Because I think the issue here, again, I think we're working in two levels, unfortunately. Some people are here for the affordable housing plan, which is the bigger picture, longer term, and then I understand there are a number of questions on Prospect Ridge. And I've tried to take good notes here tonight. The gentleman who's been standing for about as long as I have, so please, you're next.
I have a box suggestion. That is, to think about your housing needs in Ridgefield as though there was no 830G. 830G, I think, first of all, 10% is arbitrary, it's capricious. One size does not fit all. 10% is the right number for Connecticut, but it's not the right number for Ridgefield. And if you look at all the towns in Connecticut, half of them have a affordable housing percentage of the median is 4.19. So most of them, half of them are, down where we are. And if you look at the affordable housing percentage in all the towns, and you looked at the poverty rate in all the towns, you would find that it's highly correlated. Affordable housing tends to go where the poverty is. And you can say, well, maybe the poverty goes where the housing is. I ordered a chicken and egg and Amazon to see which one comes first. But the fact is if you took 830G out of your mind and say, let's do what's best for Ridgefield. What does Ridgefield really need? His numbers about people who are in Dallas or whatever his numbers are. That's a good starting place. But starting out saying we've got to put 900 units in. The 830G is a false thing. One thing, big stick is that a developer's going to come in and put something someplace that you don't want it because of 830G. It's an investment. It would be crazy to put it in a high-income town that doesn't need it. I mean, affordable housing tends to go where it's needed. Investors are smart enough to know that they're going to invest in a place when there's demand. You have to look at what the demand is
Agreed.
Yes, sir. Good evening. My name is Greg Kabasakali, and I am a member of the Board of Finance, and I am not here in that capacity this evening. I, however, am someone that grew up in Ridgefield, and by the grace of God, and a lot of hard work, I'm still here. I'm going to vocalize something that I haven't quite heard tonight. As a child, growing up on Round Lake Road, there was a baseball field called Satchel Field. It's still there. Many a summer day was spent on Satchel Field. It's a natural resource that Ridgefield has that a lot of towns don't. As I take that train to New York City, south and west of here, to go to my job, I watched the baseball field get destroyed, and a high-rise building was put up. That field was gone. Once we lose it, never come back. Tear down that Prospect Woods, you tear down whatever you want to tear down, go outside tonight. Smell the air of Ridgefield. You'll lose it. It'll be gone. It'll be gone. Our natural resources are one of the most critical aspects to this town. They must be preserved. They must be respected. And please be careful where you're putting these facilities.
All right, any other, we're getting close to our 9 o'clock. Is there anybody, is there anybody, yes, you haven't spoken.
I just think that a lot of, I'm Tony Perrelli. I believe that a lot of the confusion and ideas that people have are based on the fact that I'm not seeing a lot of organization here yet. I'm sure you guys, it's not a criticism at all. I'm assuming you have an organization, you have someone in charge of understanding the whole town of Ridgefield, every house and every building that's in it, and you have a vision, given this 830G or whatever the rules are, that you need to consider a lot of what people just said here, but also the very long-term vision. And I was joking with Gloria a minute ago. You need a parking garage, you need a wider Main Street, you need they were jokes, but in reality, we're adding all of these units to the town. It's got to be planned out properly with an organization, with an engineer, with whatever other experts we need. But I haven't seen that in the presentation. Maybe you have it, maybe you don't, but it might be the next time you present, you might want to present the organization and the experts and the expertise that you're using and the long-term vision.
Thank you. So I'm looking for a speaker. People haven't spoken yet. You're next, sir.
Just one quick question on this 830G, the developers. Who makes sure that they are compliant?
When the application is submitted, staff has historically been very careful making sure that they meet statutory criteria, because it's not until they've shown or proven that they get this 830G protection, if you will, on the application.
But they get the 830G protection, but then they have to rent the places, let's say.
Yes. Planning and zoning.
With 80 to 60 to even down to 30% AMIs, or?
So what happens is, as part of this application, they are required to submit what's called an affordability plan. And again, that was a little bit of kind of Wild West. The town now has a standard plan that developers are required to follow or declare why they feel they should modify it. And the town now requires the use of an approved administrator, which is generally third party, unless you're a developer who has an accomplished accounting staff or you're familiar with this, in which case you can do it. So the town has instituted procedures to monitor during the course of this period so that it is.
These are the town instituted procedures to monitor. Well, who's monitoring?
I can answer that. I can answer that. The Planning and Zoning Commission maintains a list of all of the properties under 8-30G and requires every year that they submit an affidavit that they are complying with it. if they are in violation, it's considered a zoning violation. It's very, very weak teeth in this law. And they are subject to penalties through the Planning and Zoning Commission.
Do they have an audit to make sure that the affidavit is true, or?
I don't know the answer to that. I know they're collecting the information. I know that they're sworn affidavits. So I think that a landlord would not be likely to put him or herself at risk. But there have been issues with compliance in the past. For example, some things have been sold that were not allowed. They were sold at market rate when they shouldn't have been. This was before the level of compliance that exists now was instituted.
People are trying. Yes, go ahead.
So regarding the increased assistance living housing, that's confusing. Because it's to us, but it should be financial assistance living. My question is, if you look at properties like Bell Green and private housing, Bell Green, for example, has market rate apartments. So are those kind of to that number, even though there are market rate rents in there?
So there's such a kaleidoscope of different state and federal programs in terms of financing. So an assisted housing project may not be 100% affordable units. Most of them tend to be, but sometimes they are not. So I can't really comment on.
Right. So my understanding is that there are several apartments at Bell Green today. They're counting it as part of that number. Are being charged market rate rents. So we need to dig into that. Do we make sure we have a number?
I think I've not spoken yet.
Oh, I'm sorry. On a few slides back, you said a complete community.
Yes.
What exactly is a complete community?
So the concept of a complete community, and again, it's a sort of professional darky phrase, but use the second paragraph here. Complete communities meet the basic needs of all people through a diverse mix of housing types, a diverse mix of land uses relevant to residents' daily lives. So in other words, it's not just a residential community, there's employment and other situations in there. Activities located within walking distance of each other where possible, and the availability of transportation options. So it's a holistic view of sort of contained neighborhoods and complete communities. It's the term. So
Who made that? Who made that up?
I mean, Wikipedia is I can't tell you who made it up. I mean, I didn't check the source, but it's.
I think it's Wikipedia.
No, it is Wikipedia. Wikipedia. They have contributors who do it. I don't know. I did notice in the article that the spelling was some of the spelling was Canadian, so it could have been. So hang on a second. Is there anybody else who has not spoken yet would like to go here tonight? All right, we're down to 1 or 2 minutes left. So who wants to? Okay, I got 3 people. So go ahead.
Can you post the slides online? They're great slides.
Yep.
They posted, and is there a state document that applies the minimum requirements to the report that we're supposed to do? Okay, if that's a bit. So is there,
Okay, so 2, yes. So the question first of all, slide online, Dave and I will take care of that. The second is the State Department of Housing with a group called the Regional Planning Agency. I don't know if you've heard of them. It is a group based out of New York. It's a nonprofit group. And they created a report in November of last year called the Framework for Affordable Housing Plans or something like that. And so if you can remember enough of that to search for it, it's the framework. It'll you get a picture of that.
I mean, that's how we work closely with Lake. It's hard to do like that.
Thank you much. Take care of that. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, the question about how you determine the need for housing. So you have percentages of people that, I forget, whatever you. Right, so you would say that percentage of people need housing.
It means an indication of need. I mean, some people are quite comfortable in the scenario. They find themselves in even if their housing costs burden. So the issue is need needs to be sort of an artful term rather than a scientific term. These are measures of need, and housing cost burden is one of them. So I think as we assemble the report, we will provide this information, provide the sources for it, so that we can have a robust discussion about, what factors that indicate.
But that would say how many units are needed in our town, or approximately. I know you don't like it.
No, I mean, I think the question ends up being, there are studies floating around the state of Connecticut that identify housing needs using different metrics, and they would likely say that Ridgefield needs thousands of units. Now,
But when the units are completed, anyone is eligible to live there. So my question is, how do you define the need isn't met? You're saying this many people need units, and then.
So we'll talk it through. So hang on a second here. Gentleman in the back has not spoken yet. Go ahead. We're not at the inventory or waiting list stage. We do know that the housing authority has a waiting list. We know how many units we actually need.
There is a waiting list.
At the housing authority, there is.
There's a waiting list for Valley Green.
No, that's a housing authority. You're right. I'm saying that the housing authority maintains a list. That's what I was trying to say.
Okay.
That they have that. The question is, there are people who are not elderly or disabled or otherwise eligible for housing authority units, but the need still exists. So this concept of need is not just who signed up, it's also people who have not signed up because they don't qualify for that type of scenario. So, really don't know. I think the issue is, where we do have that indication of being what is the waiting list, we should report that. I just think that that's. So I think, yes, who would like to go first?
I don't know, whoever. I'll go quick. I'm sorry.
You know, Rob gave procedures for it.
So, one of my concerns, like it talks about the availability of transportation options, and we do not have multiple transportation options. Essentially, you need a car to live in this town. We have no busing service, we have no train service. That's in Ridgefield. So, I appreciate the work that you're all doing on this, especially you. I do. Whether we always agree, you're putting in time. But these are very concrete questions that we need to have answers to in order to have an effective plan.
Sure.
So I'm concerned, so in your planning, I would say sooner than later, can you discuss what arrangements you're making to offer transportation to people who may come to live here to work who don't have a car? Like, are we going to start a bus service? Like when we start having municipal busing? Like to get around town and to Danbury? But without it, and finally, the new zoning thing, laws from the state are allowing people to require housing or building a certain percent that do not require parking requirements to go in each unit. Right now, we're doing affordable units that have specific parking number requirements. And new requirements from the state are saying they're going to exempt some of those parking requirements. So we could essentially face people putting in buildings that are required to put in the pertinent parking spaces for people's cars. And that could also be a problem in this area. So I hope you'll address that, because that's a big one. Because people wouldn't be able to park on the street, or like, where would they park? If you picture the Live or No building on Gilbert.
We got it.
Right?
We understand your question. Yeah. You don't have to keep explaining it. We got it.
I just wanted to and I don't know if you're going home, you should go home. I own a beautiful house in Ridgefield. I've been in Ridgefield for almost 30 years now.
Will taxpayers be the first ones on
I
the
think
list?
that's one of the things we're trying to figure out is the whole housing option thing, which is more than just affordable, et cetera. So thank you for that comment. I think, David, if you're okay, it's 9:05. Colin?
Okay, well, yes, thank you all for coming down tonight. Thank you for the civil discussion. This is just the kickoff. There will be lots more to go. Good night.
Ahmad Howie, you
Oh,
communicated by email?
yes. Let me just figure out how to turn this off.
Oh, yeah, please turn it off.